We are going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Lemack. I'm the Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum, and I'd like to welcome you for the very first annual Stefan Bielinski Memorial Lecture. And before we get to the main event, I want to acknowledge Stefan Bielinski. Steve was hired here at the museum in 1970 as a historian and retired in 2013. Over those 43 years, he accomplished a great deal, hosting hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds, of interns and volunteers. He organized the New York State History Conference, and he researched and wrote extensively on New York State history. Professionally, Steve's greatest legacy is his work on the people of Colonial Albany. He chose to make that research accessible to everyone through the World Wide Web, rather than a traditional monograph that would sit and gather dust on a library shelf. I think one of the reasons Steve was such a good historian is that he was genuinely interested in people, whether they were from the 18th century or the 21st. He just loved learning about people. Honestly, Steve could go to the DMV, strike up a conversation in line, and within minutes know somebody's entire life story. He was deeply curious, kind, and a lot of fun to be around. And Steve was a huge fan of our speaker. After every Russell Shorto talk, and there were several here in Albany, as I'm sure many of you know, you could count on several days of Steve gushing over what he learned and offering his thoughtful critiques, all positive. The book I remember him going absolutely bananas over was Small Time, A Story of My Family and the Mob. He was so interested in how you, Russell, wrote about your immigrant family. He just loved it. So it feels especially fitting that we're gathered here today to hear from one of Steve's favorites, and someone whose work continues to deepen our understanding of New York's past. Russell Shorto is the best-selling author of 8 books, including Revolution Song, Amsterdam, and my favorite, Island in the Center of the World. His new book, Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America, tells the story of the English invasion of Dutch-controlled New Amsterdam. The second taking, coming 40 years after the Dutch appropriated Manhattan Island from the Native Americans, centers on a pivotal standoff between the little-remembered English military officer Richard Nicolls and Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch Director General of New Netherland from 1647 to 1664. Russell is the director of the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society and senior scholar at the New Netherland Institute. In 2009, he was awarded a knighthood from the Dutch government for his work in deepening historical understanding between the Netherlands and the United States. Please join me in welcoming Russell Shorto.
Thank you, Jennifer, for a very generous introduction. Before I do anything else, I'm going to take your picture, which I won't use for commercial purposes, I promise. It'll be just for social media. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Very kind of you. It is great to be back in Albany, and thank you to New York State Museum for hosting this event, and for all of you coming here. Many familiar faces and many unfamiliar, so what could be better? I'm going to talk about the new book, Taking Manhattan, but first I, too, am going to talk a little bit about Steve Bielinski, mainly from my own perspective. I think Charlie Gehring, many of you know Charlie, who's sitting right here in the front. Charlie introduced me to Steve, and I guess in 2016, I was starting or somewhere involved in work on the book Revolution Song. I had this idea to write a book about the American Revolution that would not write about the revolution per se, but just I wanted to pick 6 people, or ended up being 6 people, from different walks of life who may or may not have had contact with one another, but the experiment was to try to weave their life stories together. And in so doing, by the time you got to the end of it, you would have experienced the American Revolution in different ways. So I think I was playing around with the People of Colonial Albany project, and then I talked to Steve about this idea, and we had a series of conversations, and then I think he suggested Abraham Yates, and I just became captivated by him. And Steve was absolutely right, and so he became one of the figures in the book. And he's such a great figure because he's a shoemaker who becomes this ardent patriot, a member of the Committee of Safety, and leading the cause in a political way in New York State, and then does this really interesting pivot, which a lot of leaders did, and became this virulent opponent of the Constitution, the idea of the Constitution, and gets into all these battles with Alexander Hamilton over it, fearing that, we could ultimately be in a state where we end up with someone who tries to be a king. So I think he would be saying, see. So anyway, Abraham Yates was a great figure, and Steve pointed me to him. And I'm sure many of you here have used the People of Colonial Albany project. And if you haven't, it's fun because it's a tour of, Tricia, I don't know where you are, but you were part of the beginning of that, right? You were there from the beginning on that. And does this go back to the 90s?
Yeah, I think early 90s.
Early 90s. So the early days of the internet.
Everybody on an index card, and then the index cards went
So from index cards, yeah. So, I mean, it's also like taking a tour of what the internet used to be, which is kind of charming. And, 3,900 separate entries, and you'd click on that, and it'd be an alphabetical list, and you can do this still because, and Jennifer just told me that it is now slowly in the process of being wikified, I guess, so brought up to the current levels. So you'd click on a name of someone, which I just picked at random, and Harmona Schuyler, a resident of Albany in the 1700s, all this information about him, and you'll see that like exclamation points here and there. His 3 sons served in the Revolutionary cause. I mean, you get Steve's personality in there too. And all of these links, which you click, like say you wanted to click on his mother, so then you get some information about her, and it's all very grounded in primary sources, but with little bits of personality in there too. And then if you, for example, wanted to click on her mother, that takes you back further. And now we're in 1655. Now we're in the New Netherland period, the Dutch period. And it's a lot of fun to play with because you can just get lost in it. And Jennifer just told me that when the site goes down, she starts getting calls from people complaining. So people are using it, which is wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my newest book, Taking Manhattan, which is not just about Manhattan. It's about taking New Netherland, which is this whole colony extending up to where we are today. And New Netherland encompassed all or parts of 5 future states. And it's appropriate, especially here, to begin with a Len Tantillo painting. I guess Len isn't here, but I'm sure a lot of you know Len. Our great historical artist whose work is incomparably researched. And I will start, what I'll do quickly is just give a broad overview of New Netherland. Then I'll move to the English side, and then I'll kind of pull the 2 things together. And when I start with New Netherland, to me, it starts with this, what people used to think of as this paucity of information about the Dutch period. And this was a historian in the early 20th century wrote this, and it jumped out at me. Original sources of information concerning the early Dutch settlers of Manhattan Island are neither many nor rich. The Dutch wrote very little, and on the whole, their records are meager. So, bring on Charlie and Yanni, Yanni Venema. So Charlie started in 1974, translating the 12,000 pages of records. That's just the official records of the colony. And Yanni started in 1984. Yanni retired several years ago. Charlie retired in April of this year after 51 years on the job. And when I met them in 2000, just because I was curious about the Dutch beginnings, they invited me here and to what was then their office on the 8th floor. And Yanni gave me a kind of a primer of how to make your way around a 17th century Dutch document, one of these things. And they assisted me in every way. And out of that came my book, The Island at the Center of the World, which is 21 years ago. And quickly, to go over that piece of history, it begins with Henry Hudson, an Englishman who who knew a lot about. He was a state of the art knowledge he had about what people understood the geography of the world to be. He had made many voyages on behalf of the Muscovy Company, an English company, which, as the name suggests, mostly did business with Russia in the fur trade. And for reasons we don't know, the Muscovy Company dropped him in 1608. The Dutch found out about this. The Dutch wanted a seasoned mariner to get a short route to Asia. So they, I have to look at what my slides are to see how I'm going to veer with the story. So they invited him into this building, which still stands in Amsterdam. It was the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company. It's now administrative building of the University of Amsterdam. And they asked him to undertake a mission to sail not west, but east, and find a short route to Asia. He had tried that already, and he didn't think it was possible. But they insisted. He was all for taking a westerly route. So I have to look at my next slide. So he starts off east, and as he knew would happen, quickly becomes icebound. So announces to his crew, no, we're going to go west. And instead, they went across the Atlantic Ocean, and he believed there was a short route. There was a strait across the North American continent, and people thought the North American continent was much slimmer than it actually is. So the idea was, instead of getting to Ohio, you would get to the Sea of Japan, and you would be on the doorstep of Asia and its riches. So that you can see when you track his route here, that's what he's doing. He's looking for that. Where is this thing? So when he comes upon the river that would eventually be named for him, he thinks maybe this is it, because it's a tidal river, so it's salty, and they think, okay, it's going to eventually jog westward, and we'll get to our destination. So in doing this, he charts this territory on behalf of the Dutch, who had hired him, and ultimately decides, no, this isn't the channel to Asia that I thought, and he exits the stage. Then in 1621, that was 1609, in 1621, the West India Company comes into being to try to do what the East India Company did so successfully. The East Indies meant Asia, the West Indies meant coastal North America, the Caribbean, and South America. So to try to exploit these areas. This is the headquarters of the West India Company in Amsterdam. And fun fact, just off all the way to the left used to be my office. I was the director of the John Adams Institute, the American Culture Center in Amsterdam. So a friend of mine said, it's like you crawled up inside your own book. So it's a great building. To this day, it's now, this is all now a restaurant on the ground floor, and there's offices and things. So they then took, the West India Company picked up on the claims that Hudson made on behalf of the Dutch, and that then we get the territory, the colony of New Netherland coming into being. So this is an illustration from the island at the center of the world, just giving you a sense of the lay of the land in and around New York City. Fort Amsterdam, New Amsterdam, all the way at the bottom there at the tip of Manhattan Island. That was the city. The rest of the island, largely wilderness. You see some Dutch features, Pavonia, New Jersey, New Harlem, which of course becomes Harlem. Jumping ahead, what the Dutch understood from the native people was that the Hudson River, when you come up to this area, it more or less intersects the Mohawk River Valley, and that you could ultimately use these to get deep into the interior of the continent, because of course rivers were the highways. It was beyond imagination to think of going overland and really doing business. So that was their game plan. That was their long game, which only became realized in the 1820s, exactly 200 years ago, when the Erie Canal was completed, and that made it a navigable waterway. And when that happened, that's when Albany and Troy and Schenectady and these towns really take off in their might, and that's when New York City takes off as this fulcrum between all the world's goods and products and the interior of the American continent, and that's really when all the cities around the Great Lakes start to come into being. So as the country develops at that time very rapidly, there's this echo of what the Dutch in the 1600s were thinking, what they had in mind. More or less the same map, but with a native overlay. This looks complicated. In fact, this is drastically simplified. The native people who were most in play in the Dutch period are, you can see around the New York City area, the Delaware, also called the Munsee or Lenape, up on the eastern side of the Hudson River, the Mohican, and then on the western side and extending westward, you have the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations. This is from Ganondagan, the state historic site, where they have a replica Haudenosaunee longhouse. And if you've never been, just being and stepping inside a longhouse, you get it. It feels like this is a whole way of life. It's a whole civilization here. So this, Len did this map, Len Tantillo, for a talk that we gave together, and that orange squiggle more or less covers what was New Netherland. And you can see there how water for the Dutch, waterways and water access was what mattered. So you see the Delaware River, which they called the Fresh River, and then the Hudson, and then the Connecticut River, and then ultimately the Mohawk as well. These are to them what makes this the most strategic portion of the Atlantic seaboard. And then early on, at least, fur, particularly beaver, was what the business plan was built on. So the idea was not to trap, but to trade with native people for furs, then bring them to New Amsterdam, and from New York Harbor to Europe. The story, as I tell it in The Island at the Center of the World, the story of New Netherland, focuses on a struggle between two people, Peter Stuyvesant on the left, and we're not sure that this is a portrait of Adrian van der Donck, but it is labeled that in the National Gallery of Art. Stuyvesant was the last director of the colony, as Jennifer said, from 1647 to 1664, the most capable. And van der Donck was appointed by the community. He was named the president of the commonalty. So he was kind of the head of the opposition party. The West India Company wanted to run the company as a company, or the colony as a company town. The inhabitants bristled at that. They wanted the full slate of Dutch laws and privileges to apply to them. And so van der Donck tried to do that, and these two butted heads. And at the height of the conflict, Stuyvesant throws Van der Donck into prison. He at one point threatens to try him and execute him for treason. Van der Donck eventually gets out, and he leads a delegation to Europe where they petition for the colony and for New Amsterdam to have a charter. It actually gets the charter. So that's kind of the framework for one framework anyway for understanding what New Netherland was all about. While Van der Donck was there, he wrote this book, A Description of New Netherland, which became the way many people in Europe first heard of a place called Manhattan and this colony of New Netherland. And he was a real historian and student of topography and of the native people. He wrote about the native people there. He just talked about how they decline how they conjugate their verbs, and he just talked the place up and said, the trees are taller, the animals are bigger, and he got hundreds of people wanting to emigrate, and he rented a ship and brought over colonists. So he became kind of a one-man booster. Just talking quickly about some of the other inhabitants of the colony, Joris Rapalje and Katerina Trico. Many of you are probably familiar with them in Island at the center of the world. I called them the Adam and Eve of New Netherland because they had 11 children between them, and all 11 of them grew to have children, which was unusual. And so their descendants number today in the millions. And I pretty regularly get emails from people saying, I'm a descendant of Catalina and Joris. And this was they were, I think he was 20 and she was 19 when they met in Amsterdam. And they were Walloons, and they went to the Walloon church, the French-speaking church in Amsterdam, which still stands. And they indicated their intention to get married. They got married, I think, 2 days before the ship left for New Netherland. And you can see Joris' name in the top left, and you see the big Katarina there sort of in the center. And you can see that they were illiterate. They made their marks at the bottom. So they kind of represent the colonists. They at one point had an inn in New Amsterdam, and so I'm curating an exhibit right now at the New York Historical, which will open May 1st, called Old Masters New Amsterdam, and we're bringing, I think, about 60 Dutch Old Master paintings with the idea that we don't have much to give us a sense in terms of artists who were in the colony. To give you a physical sense of what it looked like. But we can use the old master painters because they were painting the world around them, and because New Netherland, they were trying to recreate the homeland. So the conceit of the show is that we can use some of their work by picking and choosing to give us an idea of what New Netherland was like. So this is an interior tavern scene that might as well have been in New Netherland. I have a record here from the official records to represent Dorothea Angola, which allows me to just touch briefly on the issue of slavery in the colony. Of course, you could go on. People are now writing very good books about slavery in New Netherland. You can come in and sit down if you like. The first slaves probably arrived in 1627. Jaap Jacobs, the historian, has done research recently, fascinating research into how that first voyage came about. They were captured. It was a Portuguese ship that was captured off of Venezuela. And they were at war. The Dutch were at war with Spain and Portugal. And they had found out, the Dutch, they had realized that there was this new colony. New Amsterdam had just been founded the year before. And so they brought them there. They said, what are we going to do? There was these slaves on the ship. And so they brought 22 people there. So Dorothea was probably one of those first enslaved Africans in the colony. She was probably a teenager at the time. She ended up living her whole life in New Amsterdam and then New York. This is a document in which she and her second husband petition. They had earlier petitioned. She had petitioned for her freedom and received it. Then in this petition, she and her second husband had adopted a boy from another enslaved couple who had died, and they are asking here that he not be taken up into slavery again. He's now turned 18, and according to this fuzzy way of that the laws were, or the regulations were written, technically the West India Company could have reclaimed him, but they are saying, please, can you promise that he'll be freed? And they actually did. This is not Margaret Hardenbrook. It's another of these paintings we're going to have in the exhibit. But I'm using this to just talk for a moment about her. She is a late arrival in the colony. She arrives in 1659. I think she was 22 years old at the time. She came intending to be an accountant. She ended up very quickly marrying elderly compared to her Dutch man who was a wealthy trader, and he dies shortly thereafter. She inherits his estate, and then she eventually marries the young carpenter, Frederick Phillips. And the whole Phillips family dynasty springs from this marriage, and I think there's a case to be made that it's really her rather than Frederick Phillips who was the brains behind it. But once the colony switched to the English, a woman's name couldn't be on the company documents, so everything becomes Phillips. New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, just to summarize, there were 18 languages being spoken, famously in 1643. The Dutch in Amsterdam at the same time founded the world's first stock exchange. They pioneered the notion of shares of stock, of capitalism. So it's not surprising that this on the upper right is New York City at some point in the past put these wooden blocks down the middle of Wall Street to represent where the wall ran. It's not surprising that New Amsterdam, and Wall Street in particular, becomes synonymous with finance in North America. So the argument I made in I Don't Understand the World was that this becomes a hub of pluralism, of relative tolerance. You have to say relative. I mean, they have slavery, for goodness sake. Relative tolerance, pluralism, and capitalism. And that is a recipe for New York City, but not just New York City. It becomes more broadly a recipe for much of American culture. Last year, I curated an exhibit called New York Before New York that was built around the Castello plan that we had on loan from the Biblioteca Lorenziana in Florence. I could talk about why it ended up there. But this is the map of the plan of New Amsterdam in 1660. It's angled so south is to the left, so it's a little confusing. But it's the wall at what became Wall Street is on the right. Going up along the top, it was originally the native trail, the Wakaskek Trail, which becomes the Herenweg, the Gentleman's Way, and then ultimately becomes Broadway. Charlie and I years ago gave walking tours of the financial district. This is the financial district, using this. So people often ask me, what's evidence, what is the material evidence remaining of New Amsterdam? It's the street pattern of the financial district is still New Amsterdam. We had this very precious object in the exhibit from the Dutch National Archives. The Dutch infamously purchased the island of Manhattan from the native people, probably the Lenape or Munsee people. We don't have the deed. It's been lost. But what we have is this document where after that event in 1626, the next ship that went to the home country, there was a government official who did what I guess they always did. He interviewed the captain and the passengers and then wrote a summary for his bosses, and that's what he's doing here. And you can see, He says right there, at Island Manhattan. So that's, I think, the first written record of Manhattan. So they have purchased the island of Manhattan from the native people for the value of 60 guilders. He lists here how many different beavers and otters and minks, furs are on the ship. I could go on and on about what it did and didn't mean, this purchase. But very briefly, the Dutch people understood perfectly well that the native people didn't have the same notion of real estate and property transfer. They knew that for them, they would enter into an agreement which was more like an alliance, saying, we'll allow you to live here and we'll each get something out of it. The native people would have valued European manufactured goods. So by allowing the Dutch to have a presence, they could have a ready source of bringing furs and getting knives and muskets and kettles and things like that. Maybe that was, and at the same time, the Dutch wanted a deed because that's how they operated, and they wanted to be able to show others, French, other Dutch, English, that they had something on paper. Of course, very quickly, that their understanding of the native understanding of what this relationship, what this agreement was, changed. They decided, no, we have a record of it, it's ours, and that's all there is to it. We had this as well in the exhibit from the Dutch National Archives. I said before, there are very few physical renderings of what New Amsterdam was like. This is almost the sole exception. And someone made a drawing of New Amsterdam, and they sent it to Europe, where the artist Johannes Vingboons made this watercolor out of it. And one interesting thing about it is across the top, it says New Amsterdam, or now New York, on the island of Manhattan. So this was 1664. This is almost a snapshot of the moment of the English takeover. It's like Vingboons finishes his illustrations and is about to call it New Amsterdam, and someone says, oh, now it's called New York, and so he has to change it. There are many iterations. The Dutch were the great cartographers of the era, and you could go on forever about this map. This is the most accurate map of this section of the country for a long time. There were 28 different versions of it. This one is actually from after the English takeover, because you see it says Nova Belgica, which is New Netherland in Latin, and then it says New Nederland. Then it says New York, York spelled with a J. So this is after 1664, this version of it. Well, I could go on about that map, but I'll have to move on. Just quickly, in this exhibit, I wanted to make the point in the exhibit that it was not a Dutch story, not just a European story, it was a multicultural story. So on the left there, that basket was found in 1983 in a dig in the financial district when they were putting up a skyscraper. And in it were all those items in the bottom left. It's what is called an impungu, which means collection. That plate was on the top, and all the items were in it. And so in West Central African culture, a healer would gather certain kinds of objects to do a certain type of healing. And this was found outside the home, buried below ground level, outside the home of Cornelis van Tienhoven, who was Peter Stuyvesant's right-hand man. So whether this belonged to enslaved people who lived with him, we don't know. But it's possibly the only African artifact of New Amsterdam. The man in the middle may have been a Munsee man who took part in what is called Kieft's War in the 1640s against the Dutch. He was captured, and 2 Dutch soldiers later brought him to Europe and exhibited him for money. Wenceslas Holler was a renowned Bohemian artist and engraver, and he was seemed to be particularly interested in depicting people from far-flung places. So he did several of Native American people. And then that is a blow-up from the map I showed you a moment ago showing a longhouse village. So making the point here that this was really an intersection of several different cultures. Okay, now I'm coming to my story. That was all background. But so that's all the Dutch part of the story. Now the English side of the story. Throughout this whole period that I'm talking about, England is in crisis. Starting in the early 1600s, you have the Puritans starting to gain power under James I. He's able to kind of keep them at bay, but over the next couple of decades, they gain more and more power, especially in Parliament. They reach the point where they are in control in Parliament, and it reaches a head, literally, when they capture Charles I, the king, and as you can see in the engraving on the right, which is from the period, they behead him in front of the banquet house, and that little that shows the different stages of the beheading. This horrific moment in English history. You have in this period of English Civil War. After the king is beheaded, his two young sons flee into exile in Europe, and Oliver Cromwell in the center there becomes the Puritan leader of England. And people talk about the English Civil War, they talk about the Puritans and the Royalists, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer, because the Puritans were, I think of as religious extremists, who wanted to take over, who thought that the Church of England was corrupt. The king is the head of the Church of England. The monarchy is corrupt. They wanted to take over the government and outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater, and make everyone conform to their way of obeying God's dictates. So the Royalists, yes, there were people who were great supporters of the monarchy, but I think it's more appropriate to think of that party as anti-Puritans. They were everybody who didn't want the Puritans to take over and outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater. Nevertheless, that's exactly what happened. Let me see what my next slide is. Okay, so Jennifer said before, this little-known figure of Richard Nichols, so I will begin talking about him here. Any histories of early New York, colonial New York, will talk about the Dutch period and then give a sentence or two to Richard Nichols as the person who took the colony from the Dutch on behalf of the English. So for me, this book was a great opportunity to research a figure who has been quite significant historically, but little known, little appreciated. So I went with my wife and son to his hometown in Bedfordshire, which is called Ampthill. And the town historian took us around town and took us to the archives and just gave us this great sense of things. So why would the English, once the monarchy returns, why would they decide on this man to undertake this mission? That was kind of what was in the back of my mind, that question. Charles I, obviously before he had his head cut off, he was a great hunter, and he went regularly with his two young sons to this place because this royal hunting preserve surrounded the town. And where they would stay was in the lodge of the keeper of the hunting preserve, who was Richard Nichols' father. So Richard Nichols then grows up with these two young princes, and repeatedly they would come and stay in his house with him. And so you get this sense of this deep ongoing connection between them. When the war breaks out, they flee to Europe. He goes with them, along with many others. He becomes, let me see what my next slide is. Oh, this is in the church in the in the town. Richard Nichols isn't terribly remembered, but in Ampthill they remember him. They have a whole tomb there with this, and that's from the period after he died in 1672. This little paragraph of facts about him, and you see they have adorned it with American and English flags, and in the center at the top there is supposedly the cannonball that killed him in 1672 in battle. I don't know how someone at the time would have known, oh, this guy's going to become renowned later, so let's grab that. Okay, so this, I won't go into this, it looks forbidding. But while he is with the royal brothers in Europe, he's acting as a spy, and he's back and forth across the English Channel on all these missions. And he and many others who were involved in the effort to get the Stuarts back on the throne and to defeat the Puritans, they're writing letters in cipher. So a lot of the fun that I had in researching this book was going to the UK National Archives and to Oxford University, where a lot of these records are kept, and just digging through things. And quite a lot of these missives are in cipher. And so they used numbers for cipher, and this is just incredibly minor detail, but this is where, when you're doing research, you get excited. It says, okay, so they decoded it above, which is helpful for me. And here it says, above this, it says Nichols arrived safe. So it's like, aha, there's a little pin I've got. At this moment, I know Nichols is here. So that, trying to trace what he was doing during this period when they were in exile was a matter of like taking these pins and then trying to connect the dots. Okay, so 1660, the Stuarts come back on the throne. They sail across the channel. Nichols comes with them. They reinstitute the monarchy, and now one of their first tasks is they want to, from our perspective, they wanted to get the British Empire going, and so they look across the Atlantic, and this is basically what they see. And their whole lives now, this is Charles II, the king, and his younger brother James, the Duke of York. They have their whole lives, they have envied the Dutch, because the Dutch are 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead of them in developing an empire. So this is essentially what they would have seen. You see New England, so English colonies in the north, and then you see Maryland and Virginia. These are English settlements there. But between those dotted lines, that whole area, boundaries, of course, were approximate, was the Dutch colony of New Netherland. And by now, the English are getting a sense of what I showed you in that earlier map, how strategically important that area is, and in particular, this harbor and the island in the harbor. So they appoint someone. They want to find someone to undertake this very difficult mission, to, 1, take this colony from the Dutch, but 2, Nichols was given a second mission. Yes, those are New England colonies, but they were by and large founded by the Puritans, the same people who had just cut off their father's head, who still, the New England Puritans didn't want anything to do with the monarchy that was now on the throne. They were minting their own currency. They were acting in many ways like a sovereign power, especially in Boston, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they give Nichols 2 missions. Take this from the Dutch, who are probably the most powerful, certainly the most powerful European country in the world at this moment, and make the New England Puritans bow down to them. And of course, they knew perfectly well he's not going to be able to phone home or send texts or anything. So they just have to give him broad latitude. So the instructions basically say, figure it out, do what you can. So they give him 4 ships, 450 soldiers. The ships are packed to the gills with gunpowder and weapons, and go at it. I have to see what my next slide is. Okay, so, and this is what people expected. They had just fought a war, the English and the Dutch. They were about to fight another one, and they expected mayhem. They expected violence. That's what Nichols had fought in the Civil War. This is what was expected. However, so that I showed you Stuyvesant already. This is not Richard Nichols. I'm just showing you someone who kind of looked like him, so you have something in mind. It frustrated me to no end that I could not find a portrait of him. But George Goring was also a colonel on the Royalist side, and he was the same age, and there's a physical description of Nichols, and he kind of looks like that. So just so you have a placeholder in your mind of the two, what's going to happen. So then he sails into the harbor. This map was 1639, the Manitus Plan, 1639. And so he may have he did a lot of homework. He may have had a map something like this to sail from the outer harbor past through the Narrows. And this is a little bit more helpful to give you a sense of what he was doing. So he sails not straight to New Amsterdam. So you see New Amsterdam at the tip of Manhattan Island, which was the capital, and that's where the fort was. He sails to Gravesend, and he anchors there. The reason for that is Nichols had done an enormous amount of research when he was in London. He interviewed people who had lived in the colony, in some cases people who had worked in Stuyvesant's administration. And he knew, just to orient you, there were all these Dutch towns on western Long Island, Vlissingen, which becomes Flushing, Vlakkenbos, which becomes Flatbush. But Gravesend was a town settled in New Netherlands, but settled by the English. And he knew that. So he knew this was relatively safe territory. So he anchors there and then starts what is really the center of the story of my book, this 2-week period in the late summer of 1664, where he's sending messengers on boats through the Narrows, and they go to the fort and they hand a message from Nichols to Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant composes a reply, sends his messengers back, and they go to Nichols' flagship and deliver it. And it is this very, the 17th century, they were very big on protocol and diplomatic nicety. At one point, when Nichols is fed up, because Stuyvesant was playing games and didn't want to, Nichols basically says, you have 24 hours and we're going to come and we're opening fire. And the messengers go off, and then they come right back. And Nichols must have been confused because they came back too quickly. And there's a scribbled reply from Stuyvesant saying, you neglected to sign your letter, so it doesn't count, basically. So then Nichols signs the letter and then, then adds a reply saying, now pay attention. And, but what transpires here is, I think you have to try to get at what is in their minds and what each wanted and what they thought was realistic. From Nichols' perspective, he had learned that this colony and this little port of New Amsterdam had become something very special. They were, it was like this little Wild West town, but with gables and, but they were a global trading port. They were doing business, and they had, as I said, 18 languages being spoken, so they had people who could speak different languages who each had trading networks. Each of these people, residents, trading with the Caribbean, with South America, with different parts of Europe. And I don't think he understood what we would call capitalism. The word didn't even exist yet, but he wanted that. He didn't just want the real estate. He probably could have beaten them, but he wanted this secret sauce, and that meant the people themselves, this society. From the Dutch side, not only Stuyvesant but his inhabitants had been trying for years to get the Dutch government and the West India Company to support them more fully. And this goes back to the story of Island at the Center of the World and the struggle between Vanderdonk and Stuyvesant over what this colony was capable of. they would write to the powers that be and say, look, we have this colony that sits astride this continent that is so vast and we can exploit it, but we need you to send more people, we need soldiers, we need equipment. And the West India Company was focused elsewhere and was never making money. That's probably the main thing. The West India Company directors were not making money out of the colony. These freelance firms based in Amsterdam would send one of their sons to open a branch office in New Amsterdam, and they figured out ways to make money. So that's how it was succeeding, but the company as a whole was not. So they were not being supported. By this point, summer of 1664, they know that. The residents of New Amsterdam know that they're on their own. So that's all that is the backdrop to this back and forth that's going on. And Stuyvesant makes a real show of, and I think he would have carried through because the soldiers were behind him in holding out and fighting and defending the place. But his inhabitants, they signed this lengthy, long list of leading citizens signed this letter to him saying, no, we don't support this move. And there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of twists and turns, and there were some unsung heroes, including two women who at one point make this little foray as kind of unofficial ambassadors, not on Stuyvesant's part, but on the part of others in the town, to Nichols to kind of give him the lay of the land. So the upshot is what they end up agreeing to is sometimes in English called articles of surrender. But nobody surrendered anything. Nobody surrendered their home or their weapons or their businesses. In fact, these articles, every one of them, and it's reproduced in the book and you can find it online, it's a Bill of Rights. It's a list of guarantees of what they will keep. So I think it was clearly this negotiation was hardest for Stuyvesant because his job was to keep this colony, to defend it. And I think, this isn't written down, it's my reading between the lines. Ultimately, he decided that his greater loyalty was to the community that he felt that he had more than anyone had built. He and his wife had lived there 17 years. They had raised their two sons, this whole vibrant community. So I think he makes this hard decision that if we can get all these rights and ensure that our way of life continues and we can maintain our wealth and our businesses, then that's the best way to keep it is to hand it over and make sure that we can keep as much of that as possible. And that then leads to what to the foundation of New York as this place of pluralism and free trade. This is just a fun little item that I threw in here. Jaap Jacobs, the historian, found this in the Dutch archives. So that happens in September. A couple of months later, because it takes that long to get across the Atlantic, Johan de Witt, the Dutch, essentially the Dutch prime minister, is in a meeting with George Downing, who is fascinating. He was the British ambassador to the Netherlands, and he was this fascinating genius, kind of vicious genius of a man who was one of the masterminds of this whole thing, this move toward empire. When the leaders of the West India Company, travel from Amsterdam to The Hague with the news that the Dutch or the English have taken the colony. And at the moment they get there to tell the prime minister this, he's actually meeting with the English ambassador. And so Jaap found this note in the archives saying, we're granting themselves to come and speak with you, and we notice that you're in conversation with Lord Downing. We consider it necessary to interfere so as to inform you we have received news that New Netherland has been conquered by the English and that the city of New Amsterdam has been renamed New York. I mean, this is like this cutting-edge document that they kept and they preserved in the archive. So just this lovely little human element of how these things must have played out. So Richard Nichols then becomes the first governor of New York. Again, amazing. There's not more notice of him. There's no monuments or anything. becomes the first governor of New York. He then writes to James, the Duke of York, and says, I gave this place the name New York. So he wasn't sent from England with that idea. He just decided, you're the Duke of York, and so I'm going to name it after you. He tells him this, by the way, along with saying what drove Nichols crazy in his 4 years was the fact that he had plans to develop all of New York Harbor into this big global trading port. And then he's in the middle of doing that, and he gets this word from his boss, the Duke of York, saying that he had just given away the western part of that to a friend who had been the governor of the island of Jersey. So that's going to become New Jersey. And Nichols, this drives him crazy because, this whole harbor, how do you now that half of it, I can't work with that. And I think sort of if you think about the Port Authority of New York, this has always been so he writes this series of letters saying, please, at one point he says, look, why don't you give them Delaware? Delaware's a nice place. And then in this same letter here, he says, he's trying to convince him, and he said, look, I gave this place the name New York, and that western side of the river I was going to call Albania, because he was also called the Duke of Albany. And my little joke here is that there are a lot of New Yorkers who still think of New Jersey as Albania. So this is finally what drives Nichols crazy, and after 4 years he requests leave to be reassigned. But he names the place, he changes the boundary. So it's no longer just this little tip of the island that's the city, it's all of Manhattan Island, which for a long time, that then becomes what New York is. So in many ways, but I think most notably in negotiating this and seeing that what the Dutch had done there, is something that he wanted to be part of his city. That, I think, is really his legacy. He also created the so-called Nichols map, which is lovely because it shows Manhattan in its original, all its twists and turns and inlets. And that's, by the way, the Duke of York, looking kind of like Robert Plant in Led Zeppelin to me. So what happens in a nutshell is that it becomes New York after the Duke of York, and many other places, though, keep their Dutch names or elements of them. Harlem, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and on. Amsterdam, Batavia, all up in this area. And in essence, then, what I just said, this slide is just summarizing what I just said, that this merger, in the book I call it really a merger of Dutchness and Englishness, ensures that New York is going to carry on and be kind of empowered by having this Dutchness, but then moving forward as the British Empire really gets going. Meanwhile, Nichols' other mission to the Puritans fails completely. The leaders in Boston are very strong. They don't feel that they need to bow down to anyone. And he fails in that mission. And interestingly, I think what that does, it sets up two competing ideological power bases in colonial America that remain part of American history. The one based in New York is relatively tolerant, relatively globally minded, business-minded. And the other one based in Boston is inward-looking, it's theocratic, it becomes America first, it becomes manifest destiny, I think, eventually. It doesn't stay rooted in Boston, of course, these things are not bound by geography. But I think that sets up two ways of understanding the country, which have been with us and are still with us to this moment. And I'm a sucker for before and after pictures, so I will. So that's New Amsterdam then, compliments of Len Tantillo, and that's New Amsterdam now. That's what the story is all about. Thank you all very much for listening to me. And if anybody has questions or comments, please. Yeah. I'll repeat it.
In Island at the Center of the World, the chapter, I believe the New York chapter, you mentioned Downing. Do Downing and Nichols, do their paths ever cross?
He asked if George Downing and Richard Nichols, if their paths ever cross. I mean, they may have, but I can't think of it. Samuel Pepys worked, in essence, under Downing. He was part of the naval administration. And I poured through Pepys's diaries, hoping that, and he refers a lot to Downing. I hoped for some reference to Nichols, but there isn't any. They may have crossed, but I can't think of where they might have. Yes?
When the Dutch came and reconquered New York for that 1 year in the 60s, 70s or so,
Yeah.
why on earth did they give it up?
He asked, so the Dutch in 1673 took New York back for a period of months. And then why did they give it back? I think Charlie might give a different answer than me, but it wasn't the Dutch who took it over. This was yet another Anglo-Dutch war in the 1670s, and these are all trade wars, and they're fighting over, this is the age of colonialism, and these European countries are grabbing pieces of other people's land and making money off of it, and then they're fighting each other over it. And what happened in that war was it was the province of Zeeland, right, that sent its own fleet. They decided, all right, we're going to send a fleet out and we're going to try to wreak some havoc with the English and maybe we can get something out of it. And they end up sailing into New York Harbor and there's basically nobody defending it. And so they just took over. And I think what happens in short is then when the word gets to The Hague, to the Dutch government, they kind of say, you did what? And they just were not, that wasn't what they were thinking. So their head wasn't there. So then when came time for the treaty, they gave it back, which is what was typical in these negotiations of treaties during these trade wars. What was unusual was what happened the first time, where the English got to keep it. If that makes sense. Somebody else? Oh, yeah.
Around that 64 is when that transfer happened. The following year, there was a whole lot of plague going on in England, especially in London. What effect, if any, did that have across the pond with the English living over here?
I'm sorry, there was a whole lot of what going on?
Plague.
Oh, plague, yeah, there was a plague. I mean, this was a chaotic period. And I think the biggest effect was to limit, I think that hamstrung Nichols in dealing with New England, with Boston. Because if you think about it, in addition to all that unrest, this is a very weak monarchy. They've come back on the throne, but they have to issue this act of oblivion to pardon all these people who had been at war against them, who were their own countrymen, and they're still there. So in all kinds of ways, their position was very tenuous, and that's just one more aspect of it. You have the Great Fire, and then a couple of years later. And we tend to think of these kings of old, as like these all-powerful creatures, and they, I think, wanted to project that, but that really limited what they could do. So all the more interesting, and speculating about what might have happened had things gone different between Nichols and Stuyvesant. There's also an argument to be made that if Stuyvesant had put up a fight, he could have held them off. The soldiers later, he got soldiers to swear affidavits because Stuyvesant had to defend himself. He was put on trial. And the soldiers said, we could have taken them. Because it's easier to defend a place than it is to attack it. And they looked out across the East River where Nichols had put out the call to Englishmen to come and aid him. And he said they were all just farmers standing there with pikes and things. And we were seasoned soldiers. We could have beaten them. So there, any number of ways it could have gone differently. Yeah.
Was the Downing of your story the namesake for the famous Downing Street, or was it one of his descendants?
Yeah, no, Downing Street is named after George Downing. And this guy is, if you haven't read about him, he's a great character because he was the leader of, he was the English ambassador to the Netherlands under the Puritans. And he somehow did this switch. He made himself invaluable to the Stuarts and said, no, I didn't really mean that. I'm really a royalist. And he stayed, and Samuel Pepys, who worked for him, called him a perfidious rogue. Everybody hated him. Supposedly, he was very wealthy, but supposedly he kept his mother in poverty. He was a total character. All right, thanks everyone. This was great. And